Hello, everyone, and welcome to MisinfoDay. MisinfoDay is hosted by the University of Washington Center for an Informed Public in partnership with the Washington State University Edward R. Murrow College of Communication. I'm Julia Scanlon, one of MisinfoDay's planners from the Center for an Informed Public. I'm so excited to be here with all of you to learn about how we can resist misinformation and be better informed. Before we start, I wanted to show you where we're all tuning in from today. We're here with students, teachers, and librarians from across Washington and the United States, and even have some people tuning in internationally. Thank you all so much for coming. This session is Disinformation Goals and Tactics, and we'll be hearing from Dr. Kate Starbird and Dr. Kalina Koltai. Kate is a co-founder of the Center for an Informed Public and an associate professor at University of Washington's Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering. She studies the spread of rumors, misinformation, and disinformation during crisis events. Coco is a postdoctoral fellow at the CIP who studies trust assessment of information and misinformation with a focus on how social networking sites and digital communities interact with information behavior practices around health and science. There will be time at the end of the session to answer your questions. So if you have questions for Kate and Coco at any point in the session, please use the Q&A form linked in the description box below to submit those. That's all from me. Kate, take it away.
All right, thank you, Julia. This is Kate Starbird, and I'm going to talk a little bit today about understanding why we're vulnerable to disinformation, and especially online. I want to start out with this photograph, and I want to have you all sort of take a look at this photograph, which was tweeted in the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey in 2017. And it claims that this shark was swimming in the floodwaters of the hurricane. So what do you think about a shark swimming in floodwaters of a hurricane? Does that sound sort of plausible to you? Does it seem exciting? Is it something that you might share if you saw it online? Well, it turns out that this wasn't true. This shark is actually not swimming in the floodwaters of Hurricane Harvey. And in fact, as a researcher of crisis informatics, I've seen this shark, the same shark, swimming in all sorts of different hurricane floodwaters because people keep taking the same photo and tweeting it out for each new event. And so if you look up shark swimming on a highway, you can learn the history of this image and see how it's been used during several different crisis events in the past to trick people, into resharing it. This version of it received 150,000 likes on Twitter and almost 90,000 retweets. So it spread really far. So we think about rumors, misinformation, and disinformation are widespread in online spaces like social media. And we know this. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why this might be true today. And I want to start out with this distinction between misinformation and disinformation. And I want to ask you for just a little bit to think about what you think the difference might be. And this is really important when we think about strategies for protecting ourselves and maybe even thinking about how social media platforms should work differently to prevent these two different kinds of things. So misinformation is information that's false, but not necessarily intentionally false. Like, when a disaster event happens, we might not know what happened. We might think that the bridge went over the dam, and in reality, the bridge went over the dam. The water went over the dam, and in reality, it just went, it didn't quite get over the dam or something else. So a rumor might start out, but maybe the people who spread it didn't know it was false at the time. Disinformation, on the other hand, is false or misleading information that's purposefully seeded and/or spread for a specific objective. For instance, a financial objective or a political objective, or even a reputational one, like the guy who shared the shark photo. He was just trying to get likes and retweets and maybe follows for his account. Other kinds of disinformation may be trying to affect, trying to sell something or maybe affect the outcomes of a political election. Disinformation is interesting because it's rarely outright false. It's often misleading. It's often built around a kernel of truth, but layered with distortions or exaggerations. And it's not usually just one piece of information, but disinformation can function as a campaign where you might see several different kinds of pieces of information that work together to create a false perception of something. And it can be really hard to detect for this reason, because it's not so simple as you can just fact check one piece of information. So when and why are we vulnerable to misinformation? It's a couple of different answers to this question. So you can think about like when maybe you've spread misinformation or disinformation, or when you've seen someone you know, like a family member, spread mis or disinformation. So one of these cases is that we're especially vulnerable to misinformation, disinformation during crisis events. A couple of different reasons for that. One of the things is during a crisis event, like a pandemic, right? We've all been experiencing one for over a year. There's a lot of uncertainty. We don't really know what's happened, and things might, the best information might be changing over time. And this can make us anxious. Like, how do we, how should we react to the crisis event? How do we protect ourselves? How do we protect our families and our loved ones? And during those times, what we do as humans is we want to come together and try to get rid of that uncertainty and get rid of that anxiety. And so we try to come up with explanations for why things might be happening. And sometimes those explanations get things right, and sometimes those explanations get things wrong. But those explanations, we call it collective sense making. And sometimes they can go awry. Unfortunately, those explanations or those processes of us making sense of a crisis event can also be exploited by people who want to manipulate our sense-making practices for their benefit. Again, to sell nutritional supplements, to sell us something, to get attention for themselves, or even to change political outcomes by manipulating how we're perceiving the crisis event and what's happening. What are some other times that we might be vulnerable to mis and disinformation? Think about when your friends or parents are most likely to share questionable information, sort of false rumors or conspiracy theories. What are they typically talking about? What are they watching on TV or looking at on their Facebook pages when they're spreading misinformation, when they're spreading disinformation especially? I would say that a lot of that was probably political. It turns out that we're very vulnerable to spreading mis and disinformation when we engage online within our political identities. And I'm going to let that sit for you. Maybe some of you you don't feel like you're very politically active, or maybe you do, you care about a couple of different kinds of pieces of activism, or care about a couple things in the world. Just these are places where we can sometimes be vulnerable when we're really thinking that we're caring about something in the world, and we can sometimes be manipulated. So I want to give you a lesson from 2016. We're going to go back in time a little bit. And I want to think about actually the Black Lives Matter conversation. Black Lives Matter is a movement to address systemic racism in the United States, and especially violence by police against African Americans. And it's something that kind of emerged online, the movement of Black Lives Matter did. As it emerged, there was also a counter movement that emerged to try to counter the message, to denigrate the Black Lives Matter message, and to lift up a message about being pro-police and against Black Lives Matter for that reason. And so this is a very polarized conversation in the United States, very political. A lot of people can see themselves maybe on one side of this conversation. And I know where I see myself, you may see yourself in a different place. What we did in our research study, we wanted to see what the conversation looked like. And we were actually studying just the movement generally initially as part of our research study. And what we did was we mapped one of the online conversations about Black Lives Matter. And in this case, we took each little dot on this graph is a Twitter user, and each dot is closer together with Twitter users who they retweeted and further apart from users that they didn't retweet. So you actually get two pieces of conversation where one group is mostly talking to themselves and the other group is mostly talking to themselves, and they're not really talking to each other. And what we see when we look deeper is that one side of this conversation is pro-Black Lives Matter and one side is anti-Black Lives Matter. Politically right and politically left. So we have sort of Democrats and liberals on the left and conservatives or Republicans on the right. Not surprising, we see this a lot in online conversations. One of the interesting things that happened at the same time we were doing this research around 2016 was Russia's Internet Research Agency was found to be interfering with the US 2016 election. By participating in our online spaces, they've deployed an army of social media trolls that were intended to manipulate US political conversations. They were trying to influence what we were doing politically in the United States. And one of the ways they did this was by creating fake personas of actual Americans on social media sites like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and others. These are actual pictures of Russian trolls, the actual pictures they used. These are not the actual pictures of them. We have no idea what they look like, but they used pictures of Americans and in their profiles. And they were impersonating Black Americans or Black Lives Matter activists on one hand and white pro-Trump conservatives on the other. And they were working to become part of these online conversations and to push their own political agenda within those conversations. So when we think back to this graph, where do you think the Russian trolls or the Russian agents were in this conversation? After Russia's campaign was exposed in 2017, the US Intelligence Committee pushed Twitter to release a list of accounts that had been run by Russian agents. And we saw that list, we recognized some of the accounts from our previous research. And it turns out those Russian agents were on both sides of the conversation. And they were, in some cases, just acting like everyone else. In other cases, they were among some of the ugliest accounts in this data set. They were advocating for violence against police on the left, and they were using racial epithets on the right. Kind of the worst behavior that we saw was sometimes not Americans, but actually Russian agents trying to sow division or make us angry at each other. Did they care about Black Lives Matter or conservative political politics in the United States? I don't think so. I think they have their own objectives, and those objectives are to make the United States weaker. Unfortunately, their accounts received hundreds of thousands of retweets from real Americans. And one of their trolls on the left was actually retweeted by Jack, the CEO of Twitter, and me. So here's a couple things we can think about. So disinformation affects people on both sides of the political spectrum, Republicans and Democrats. And disinformation targets political conversations and online activism. It's also bad for democracy. It makes us lose trust in information, in government, in our elections, and in each other. I want to fast forward. I don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to really fast forward from 2016, where we had this disinformation campaign that was foreign, inauthentic, using fake personas, and coordinated by a Russian agency that was trying to manipulate US politics. And I want to talk a little bit about 2020, where we saw another campaign, another disinformation campaign that was domestic. It was Americans using disinformation against ourselves. It was authentic. It wasn't fake accounts. It was actually real people using their own accounts, often blue check verified accounts. And it was collaborative. Nobody was organizing it. Lots of people were just acting together in ways that aligned with some of the same goals. And one of the things this campaign did was it claimed that our election was rigged or that someone was cheating. And this wasn't true. There's no evidence that there was widespread cheating in the election. Certainly there was no evidence that ballots were being printed by foreign companies. But over and over again, we saw people misinterpret things that they were seeing in the world that in ways, or lie about things they were seeing in the world in ways that tried to sow this narrative that we couldn't trust the election. In one case, we saw these people take a picture of a bunch of ballots in a trash can and say that the ballots, this meant that the election wasn't valid or that the election was somehow vulnerable. Well, these ballots weren't even from the 2020 election. They were from a different election. They were being recycled. They were already, they were worthless. They were invalid. But that's not how it spread. It spread in a very different way. We also had cases, that was on the right. On the left, we had cases where people were claiming that post office boxes were being removed in order to make it so the mail-in voting wouldn't be, so we couldn't trust it. No, this picture is actually of a place that was refurbishing the post office, the blue post office boxes. So people were taking, images of other things and saying those things made a difference in our election. And so we could see people picking up content to align with these false narratives in this very sort of participatory way. Maybe people that didn't even know that they were part of a disinformation campaign. One of the really fascinating things we saw after the election was this thing we're now calling Sharpie Gate, where people thought that because when they filled out their ballots, that when it bled through, that was causing them to lose their votes, that their votes weren't being counted. And it turns out that the ballots were designed to work that way. The Sharpie pens were actually not going to cause their votes to be invalid. But a lot of people were worried about that on election day because they saw that their ballots were bleeding through when they filled them out. And we saw tweets with people that were kind of concerned that their vote might not count. And then tweets that began to have people being suspicious that someone was trying to make it so their votes wouldn't count. And eventually those suspicions turned to accusations that someone was purposefully trying to cheat them by giving them Sharpie pens. And it turns out that these just weren't true, and their votes were being counted. It wasn't going to be a problem. And yet they misinterpreted the things that they were seeing in ways. And then eventually people were opportunistically spreading those things to try to denigrate our trust in the election results. So to summarize, I'm sorry I skipped some slides because I had to go a little faster, but one of the things that I just want to point out here is that when we're politically motivated, can sometimes become unwitting agents of disinformation campaigns. And so in this case, people were primed to be receptive of false narratives of voter fraud, to think that the election wasn't valid. And in some cases, they misinterpreted real world events to bring them, into alignment with these false and misleading narratives. And so they were actually spreading false information without even realizing it was false. And we talk about this as being people becoming unwitting agents in a disinformation campaign. So what do we do? How do we become better and more productive and responsible participants in online environments? Now, maybe you all don't have social media accounts yet. Maybe some of you do. You're just learning how to use these things. Eventually, you're all going to be participants in what it's called now citizen journalists. Every one of us can be, a participant in this sort of global conversation. And how do we do that in healthy and productive ways? And I have a couple of different recommendations. And one of those is sometimes we tend to go really fast and we're caught up in the moment, especially during a crisis event or political conversation. And we really need to slow down and kind of reflect on things before we share them, right? So just slow down a little bit. And also, I know that your teachers are going to talk a lot about when you're learning media literacy about, look at this piece of information or that piece of information. But I also really recommend to tune into our emotions. When we look at when people spread disinformation, especially, it's often because they've been emotionally activated to feel outrage or anger or self-righteousness. And so just tune into your emotions and make sure that you're not being manipulated into sharing something. Also, just check to make sure people are who they say they are. If you see someone in an online environment and they're saying, hey, join this or do this or retweet this, just kind of check to make sure you trust that that person is who they think, who they present themselves as before you pass along their content. And just learn how to take responsibility and correct ourselves and understand that everyone makes mistakes. We all are vulnerable to mis and disinformation. The most important thing is that we learn to recognize it and correct it. Correct it when we make mistakes, and then really correct others, but really carefully and with empathy and understanding. It's not that it's a bad thing to do. It's something that we all may make mistakes, but we want to be better. And so let's help each other just create a healthier information environment. All right, so thank you all very much for your time. I'm going to quickly show a slide that thanks a lot of people and collaborators and everyone else, and then I am going to pass it off to Coco to talk more about misinformation, disinformation in the context of COVID, I believe.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Kalina Koltai. I also go by Coco, so you might have heard them all. Coco, I go by both. My parents gave me that name. And I'm really excited to talk to you today about particularly about health and and misinformation, particularly in the context of the COVID-19 vaccine. Kate here talked about crisis events and us being, vulnerable to misinformation. And, that is particularly relevant today in the context of not just COVID and COVID misinformation, but misinformation about the vaccine. So I thought it'd be really useful to focus on different types of mis and disinformation that you might see, particularly around vaccines. So I don't necessarily need to spend a lot of time because I assume like everyone's heard, but just so we're all aware, there's been a pretty big wave of concern about growing hesitancy around the COVID vaccine. And while it's not really sure, there's some conflicting reports of what percentage of the US would want to get vaccinated if the vaccine is available to them. There are varying reports, but looking at a variety from Pew Research Center or the CDC, a little bit about 30% of the US, which is about 1 in 3 people, are not planning on getting the vaccine when it comes available. So, and this is a concern because ideally we want as many people to get inoculated as possible to promote herd immunity to help stop the spread of COVID. And while we don't have, there's many, many different reasons why people are vaccine hesitant. And we can definitely talk about that after the talk. But misinformation about vaccines seems to be a large part of this problem of why people don't want to get vaccinated. So let's talk about different types of dis and misinformation, particularly focusing on COVID vaccines. So misinformation, as Kate very lovely already did for me, so this is like a recap, is misinformation is often considered something that's incorrect or misleading, that's inadvertently shared to influence maybe public opinion or obscuring the truth. So there's not necessarily like a malicious intent. I've shared misinformation, Kate says we've all done it at some point. Even sharing a rumor is sharing misinformation. Versus disinformation is false information that's deliberately and covertly spread to order to influence public opinion and obscure the truth. So something that's often very deliberate. So you can imagine one person very deliberately sharing a piece of content that they know to be false, and then people sharing that content. And that's or sometimes, the difficult part in this is that, it's sometimes really difficult to tell the intent of persons. Sometimes people are very genuine in their attempt to share information, particularly when it comes to vaccines, because we want to all help protect everyone. But the difficult part is that misinformation doesn't mean it's 100% false. There's a lot of gray or things are decontextualized. So if you talk about this, I actually would have used this model that's set out by First Draft News about 7 types of mis and disinformation. And I know you don't have to read this because we're going to go through it right now. So the first one I would talk about is something called fabricated content. I think this is what most people think about when they think about mis or disinformation, or if I heard the term fake news. So the example here I have on the right is a tweet from someone who is claiming that the COVID vaccine turns the body into an operating system. I'm going to say this is completely not true. The vaccine does not turn your body into an operating system, but someone could put out a content like this and it's completely fabricated. And this is almost like it can be often very malicious, but we can easily fact check that. Another type of something is manipulated content. And this is content that often includes distortions of genuine information or imagery. So the example I have here on the right was something that came out a few weeks ago from a beach in Israel, where someone said, look, there are chairs and areas set up that are only reserved if you're vaccinated. This is an absolutely manipulated image. They do not have these chairs, it's just regular green chairs, but this bit of misinformation or disinformation from the person who created that content was spreading out around circles, falling into a narrative saying that that there's going to be different rights afforded to people who are vaccinated. So always and this could be tricky. There's different tools we can use to detect whether something is manipulated, often using reverse Google image search, for example. But this is just one of the many types. Another type of content you'll see is something called imposter content. This is content that involves genuine, impersonating genuine sources, and often using branding of an established news agency or organization. So one thing we've already been seeing is that there have been these fake websites set up by scammers to tell people you can sign up here, they collect their information, or even something below false information about COVID or the vaccine that use UNICEF branding, but not officially from UNICEF. And so this is really dangerous misinformation or disinformation, because it looks like it could be legitimate. And it takes a lot more extra work to try to figure out that this is actually not true. Another type is this idea of false context. This is when genuine content is shared, but with false contextual information, or maybe decontextualized from the original source. So the example I have here on the right is an article that says, CNN says, don't be alarmed if people start dying after taking the vaccine. You read this headline, you see the image, you're like, oh my gosh, this must mean the vaccine is completely unsafe. CNN is even admitting it. But if you actually go to the quote for that this is actually pulling from, you see that it is a real quote, but you're missing all the other context of this. And the actual context is that this expert is saying you shouldn't be alarmed, but if people do end up dying, or you hear a story about that, because some of the first people getting the COVID vaccine were people in nursing homes who are already often very sick. Dying is a normal occurrence, but knowing that it potentially would be a big news story if someone who maybe is already very close to dying gets the vaccine because they're vaccinating everyone, and then they died 2 weeks later, and then this warning. So while it was a true statement, it's very genuine content, it is a false context of what it actually means. Another type you might see something is called misleading content. And this is information that's often presented in a misleading way as something I see all the time. So the example I have here on the right is the image claiming that there are like nearly 20,000 adverse reactions to the COVID vaccine, about 1,000 deaths, and so forth, using data from something called VAERS. The difficult part is that this is could be very misleading. So for one, an adverse reaction can mean anything. It could even be like you have swelling and redness at the injection site. Second part is that this is something from a database called VAERS, which is a vaccine adverse reporting system, which is where anyone can go and like put in something they think they might have an injury, even if there's not related. So you'll see people have put in things like, I got hit by lightning afterwards, or you'll see, oh, my blood cholesterol is normal, and you'll see anyone can go there. There's no verification of this like large data set. And so when you see something that's like, oh, there's this many adverse reactions, that doesn't mean that those are all genuine cases, even though it is from that data set. And adverse doesn't necessarily mean that it's a severe reaction. Let's see. Another misinfo type is this idea of false connection. If you remember actually from Kate's example with the shark, that was maybe a genuine image of a shark, but with a false connection of the situation. So this is when headlines or visuals or captions often don't necessarily support the content. So the example I have here on the right is from a story that was spreading out online, claiming that there is this woman who was vaccinated and then later on miscarried. So the woman that's talked about in the story is not all actually related at all to this image. This is not an image of the woman. This is an image of someone else from another time showing this imagery, but it is used to imply that this is the woman who was vaccinated and then later miscarried. So this is often sometimes also will happen with like a headline does not reflect the content of an article, or maybe you have an old image being reused over and over again. And finally, this is probably the one that I get least worried about, but probably get my own personal joy from, is like satire or parody. So these are often humorous but false stories presented as if they're true, but they might unintentionally fool readers. So for example, there's a website called The Onion that does a lot of parody content. And they have this headline that says the CDC announces children will be the last to receive the COVID vaccine because what are those little turfs going to do about it? And so this is a joke article, but you can imagine someone potentially seeing this and thinking like, oh my gosh, I can't believe the CDC said that. How terrible. So since I'm going to speed through a little bit as well. But the thing about we talk about when we think about misinformation, whether it's about vaccines or politics or just something that could be very, interesting about like crisis events, like we often share this, not just in person, but particularly on social media. And algorithms for all these different social media platforms can potentially create something that's called an echo chamber to show us content that could be more and more extreme and following that. So particularly if we think about vaccine misinformation or political misinformation, you like one type, you'll potentially be shown more and more of that similar content. And these platforms are not really designed really well for civic debate. So we saw very little interaction between, say, the left and the right on on about Black Lives Matter. And this can promote really engaging in misinformation that you are susceptible to. And the truth is that there is often more value in, user interactions and engagements than telling the truth. So staying longer on a platform, engaging clicks, seeing more ads is something that's often like really valuable to companies. There's a article that came out about a study that was conducted by Facebook that showed that when they removed posts or hid posts that were quote unquote bad for the world, and people left the platform. But if you showed them that, it made people stay on the platform longer. So there's often this really difficult conversation about who is incentivized to keep misinformation available. It's maybe not just always the people who are producing this information, but even the platforms in which we access it. And each platform has their own strengths and weaknesses, but ultimately they're meant to connect people and information, and that's something they do very well. They do connect people, and they do connect you to misinformation, or in some cases, misinformation. And one of the big benefits about the internet is that you can easily access any bit of information you want at an instant. But this also means you have the same amount of access to misinformation. And misinformation can spread faster than ever before. I'm currently here in Seattle, Washington, and I can, in theory, create a rumor that can then be shared globally within a span of a few minutes, which means you can actually tailor and target different communities and demographics with different bits of misinformation. So with Kate's example, talking about Russian influence in the 2016 election, they use different bits of misinformation to target people on the left and target people on the right. In particular, when we talk about vaccine misinformation, it's no longer just relegated to like anti-vaccine circles. Since vaccines are talked about everywhere, it seems to be a daily bit of our conversation here. You potentially can get exposed to misinformation everywhere, which also makes it a really difficult thing to try to combat. The other part with talking specifically a little bit about health and science misinformation, and that this could be really intimidating to combat. You know, not everyone has a medical degree. I don't have a medical degree. I'm not an expert in how vaccines are made or produced. And it's hard for me, even for me, to go and figure out like, what do I trust and not trust about vaccines? And there are unfortunately a lot of people who are like, could be false experts, or maybe even use their own degree and their own supposed expertise to promote misinformation that might look trustworthy because it looks scientific, and we don't always have the tools to figure out whether or not that's true or not. And this is particularly powerful when people use graphs or data manipulation, show you some numbers, and you're like, I don't know, this looks right, so I'm gonna, and it's very difficult. Going through misinformation is incredibly difficult to wade through. And particularly misinformation from doctors or people who use some sort of degree or expertise can be some of the most difficult to address. The one thing I always tell people about this is that reminding you that science is about consensus. It's not necessarily about the rogue scientist or the one whistleblower. It's about, thousands of scientists who have all done very similar research. And if they're all coming to a very similar conclusion, but one person isn't, that kind of gives us some indication about, what is the science is a consensus. It's not about the one bit. So it's always good to like double check, like what else are other people saying about the topic. And as I end today, I do want to remind you that, social media and quote unquote like fake news sites are not the only contributor to the spread of misinformation. This could happen even with like mainstream media and journalists, particularly when we talk about vaccines. There is poor science communication because it's a really difficult topic to understand and talk about, and we can unintentionally do it. So there is a lot of accidental misinformation, or sometimes people taking something that is true and putting it in a misleading way. So really anyone can contribute to misinformation spread. It's not just the at the fault of, say, the person who is producing this information. Is that it's really difficult for us to go through and wade through it, and we might spread it unintentionally. So Kate talked about this emotional element. Like vaccine misinformation is so powerful because if vaccines are truly dangerous, that is something that's often scary. We've been told vaccines are safe. I believe vaccines are safe. And so if you see something like that, that challenges that, it causes an emotional reaction, you want to share it because you want to help people. So really anyone is susceptible to that. And it's no one's fault for falling for any of these like really well-crafted sometimes bits of misleading content. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Coco. Thank you, Kate. Those were really interesting presentations. We've got a lot of questions coming in. Just a reminder to those of you who are watching that there is a link in the caption of the video if you'd like to submit some questions. And it looks like, Kate, this first one actually is for you. We have somebody asking how somebody can tell if a tweet is a Russian misinformation-driven message versus an authentic message.
It's really hard. I mean, I don't think there is a way to simply tell. Often we've had to wait for the social media platforms to figure that out and tell us. I think one of the ways I look at it is like, does this person actually, I look at their profile, actually go in and click on their profile, look at some tweets. Is this something, if it's Facebook, you kind of go deeper in their profile, look at the kind of content they're sharing, figure it out if they actually know somebody that you know. And I am on the better safe than sorry. If I can't find somebody that can vouch for this person being someone that we know in some way, whether it's online or in real life, I usually kind of keep that person at a little bit of distance. Even just following someone or retweeting someone, if you're not sure about them, that can give someone else a signal that you're vouching for them. And then that's how these kinds of folks infiltrate a community, is by just getting a few people to mindlessly follow or retweet them. So I would just say be really careful to kind of look through someone's history to see who they are before you retweet or reshare or follow or friend someone that you don't know.
Great, thank you. This next question really could be for either of you. We have a question about what are the credible sources that you would recommend? So if folks are looking for sources that are legitimate, where they can go to double check what they're seeing online or in other sources, what are some go-tos that you might put out there?
One of the hard answers for news is that a lot of content that is high quality is behind a paywall. And so that when I see content that's free online, it's often a signal that it might not be the highest level, the highest quality stuff. And so that does make it difficult in online environments to get a hold of the content you want. So what I do is I subscribe to a bunch of newspapers, including the Seattle Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post, to kind of get a sense of different kinds of content. And then signals for me, for a particular journalist or someone else, is not that they've never made a mistake, but if they correct themselves when they've made a mistake. That's really important for me, to see the kinds of things that happen when that media outlet or that person, after they make a mistake, what do they do? And also to differentiate between a journalist and an opinion writer. That's the most important thing you can do, because a lot of the people, both in online spaces and in cable news, they're made to look like they're journalists, but they're really doing opinion shows, and they're political pundits. And so to be able to differentiate between opinion and news, I think is really important.
Great. Coco, anything you would add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. Particularly for me, it's like, if it's a source that I've never heard of before, I kind of just check Wikipedia about it to read a little bit about what is this source, particularly if it's not like a organization that I'm familiar with, like say CBS or NBC or something like that. But I also look to see how multiple news organizations or multiple how different people are covering maybe the same topic, right? And so, even if it could be from a mainstream news outlet that you're familiar with, but how are they covering this, and what kind of information are they giving in relationship to everyone else? So it's similar in the same way that like science is a consensus. I think news is a consensus as well, that can kind of help not only give you like differing opinions and figure out what is opinion versus what is legitimate. And you can learn and develop tools like, what do you feel like genuinely as you start building up an idea of like, what sources do I trust and not trust? It is by looking at a variety of different sources, particularly if you try to like debunk a particular topic or phenomenon or something you see. And I think the difficult part is that sometimes if it's breaking news or something that just happened, it'll take a while for something to come out that's truthful. So, and that's really difficult to sit with, because sometimes, the fact checking just isn't there yet. So sometimes we do have to wait, particularly in times of crisis or something that is brand new just happening.
Yeah, for crisis events, it's so important to slow down, because we're so exploitable right in that moment, because the official sources aren't ready to talk yet because they don't know what the situation is. And so that's just this opportunity for other people to put whatever they want out into the space to try to exploit us. So yeah, just really slowing down in the moment of a breaking news event is really important.
Great, thank you. Our next question comes from somebody who's asking, if I have a friend or a family member who has posted something and I know that it's not true, or it's not verified, or it's coming from a source that doesn't seem legitimate, what advice do you have for how I might talk to that person, what I might say to that person to have a productive and respectful conversation?
Coco might have a different answer on that. For me, like what I want to say is like, you're wrong, and that's and that doesn't help at all. We just know that if we confront them, they're very likely to go back on their heels. Now, if you correct them on their social media post, you have to recognize you're not correcting the person. They're never going to change their mind. You may be correcting their audience, so their audience can see that what they said was wrong. So think about that. But if it's someone I care about, it's a friend, a close friend, or a family member or a loved one, I think the best thing is, first, I remember that we all make mistakes, and that people don't want to be making mistakes, even if they tell you otherwise. They don't want to make mistakes. And then I try to correct them privately. So do a private message and say, hey, by the way, I don't think this is correct. Give them some evidence of where they can find the correct information, and then just say, hey, you might want to take this down, or you might want to add a note to say that this has been corrected. And if they don't, they don't, and that's okay too. But try to do it a little bit privately. If you do it publicly, for someone you care about, you may ruin that relationship.
My answer is actually not that different from Kate's. I do sometimes want to like tell people that they're wrong, but definitely just telling someone that they're wrong it's never the way to try to convince someone that they actually are wrong. And I think this varies by context, but I think if it's particularly someone that you know, I think you're in an actually very powerful position. You're in a better chance of reaching them than say someone who you don't know, a complete stranger. And so I've seen this happen with my own friends and colleagues, and I see something that, if it's something that's pretty like not harmful whatsoever, just sort of like they posted something that is like an outrageous headline, and I like, you know, I'll message them and be like, hey, I actually think this has been debunked, and I share them some sources, and I leverage my own relationship with them to say like, hey, here are some sources, we can talk about it. And then they usually end up taking the content down. That doesn't work for everything. And I think that's going to really vary. Now, if we talk about something that is going to be, that could be really hotly contested, like something like politics, that's going to be a trickier conversation to have. But I do think it's worth trying to engage with that person, not always in that public sphere, but as like Kate recommended, in that private sphere, particularly if you have that recommendation. The thing that's really impactful or something that's important to remember with some of these topics is that when people have really well-formed opinions about something that's based on misinformation, it wasn't just one piece of information, one piece of content that got them there. It was a collation of lots of misinformation that got them there. And so it's never going to be necessarily one bit of correct information that gets them out of it. You know, and I tell people that when we talk about like, you know, relatives or loved ones who are maybe becoming extremely vaccine hesitant, is that it wasn't just one thing. So it might take something time over time if you ultimately want to try to change their opinion on something. But starting already from that conversation, like, hey, I'm not sure about the source. Let's talk about it. Here's an alternative explanation for it, a counter narrative to maybe what you're seeing. And that's a good way to start.
Great. Thank you both. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Coco, for speaking with us. Thanks to all of you for tuning in and for all of your great questions. This is our final session of the day. We've had a lot of questions about the recordings, and those will be available for this session and for all of our sessions after the event. We'll also be sending out a toolkit with lessons and activities that you can use to continue this learning in your classroom. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.